Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, I'm going to tell you the things that I like and don't like about shooting on the Fuji X system. I'm pleased to announce that I'm launching 3 Capture One style packs: Metamorphic Portraits, The Sound of Silver, and Rangefinder. These will eventually also be available for Lightroom, so if you go to kevindealphotography.com, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and join my mailing list, I promise I won't send you spam, but I will let you know the second these release. And now, on to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So the whole point of today's episode is I just want to tell you from my experience of shooting on several Fuji cameras, X cameras, the things that I like and don't like about shooting on the Fuji system. Now, if you're a fanboy watching, you're going to get super excited because I'm going to tell you all the things that I like first. And if you don't like Fuji, you'll get excited when I talk about the things that I don't like. I personally don't like being a fanboy. I also shoot on Canon and I shoot on multiple film systems. And I just don't get into the whole, oh, I like this brand over this brand and this brand sucks. Most cameras out there I could shoot on and I could enjoy. I just happen to enjoy shooting on Fuji and Canon the most. So know that going in, I'm not going to like wave a banner, celebrating Fuji, but I am going to tell you the things that I love about the system, because you might be watching this video and you might be thinking, like, why should I switch to Fuji? Why should I even consider Fuji in the first place? And shooting on full frame, and I also, by the way, shoot on the Fuji GFX system, so I shoot on that medium format system. I have experience shooting on all 3 types of cameras: full frame, APS-C, and medium format. And so I definitely have opinions. And so let's start the list of things that I like about Fuji right now. Number 1. The colors, the sensors. Fuji decided they wanted to go all in on the APS-C sensor, and it offers several advantages, but they also decided they wanted to go in on film simulations. Now, that whole philosophy to me, it speaks to me because as I get older, I want to spend less and less time doing work in post-production, and I'd rather get stuff right at the camera. And my philosophical take on photography in general is I do shoot in a more editorial portrait style, and I don't necessarily want the colors to be accurate. I want them to be more artistic. And so those built-in film simulations like classic chrome, classic negative, nostalgic negative, and yes, even when I want to see the dark side of things, I like Eterna bleach bypass. They lend themselves well to my style of photography. And if you share my same school of thought where it's like, hey, I want the colors to just kind of be different and a little bit more artsy, then Fuji may very well appeal to you. Another commentary on the APS-C side of it is that in 2024, if you ever hear somebody go, oh, I don't want that camera because it's an APS-C, dismiss them immediately, because the only real way you take a bad picture on an APS-C is if you're a terrible photographer who massively underexposes shots in darkness. And if that's the case, shame on you for not knowing to use a flash. Shame on you for not taking your environment and making your exposure better. Use faster glass. There are always ways around having a terrible exposure. Use a tripod. And so if you do that, you're really not going to see the differences between APS-C and full frame 99.99% of the time that you shoot. So when you hear that know-it-all in a forum say, oh, I'm not going to shoot on that because it's an APS-C, just keep in mind that most of the time, if you know what the hell you're doing, that's never going to be an issue. Number 2, size. So I mentioned that I do shoot on Canon, and Canon does make both full frame and APS-C cameras, but they use a single mount. So even though you buy an APS-C camera from Canon, their bodies tends to be a little bit larger because they have to accommodate a larger mount. Fuji going all in on the X mount, a smaller mount, that gives them some advantages that companies like Canon and Nikon don't have. By going all in on APS-C and a smaller mount, they can focus on lenses that use less metal and use less glass, but can still let in about 1.4 and sometimes even 1.2 with a maximum aperture. This of course means that when you go do a shoot, you can take more lenses inside your bag or just take a smaller bag altogether. And of course, the other advantage is that if these lenses are smaller, then these lenses are also typically lighter. And then if they are smaller and they are lighter, that means there's less materials to be used. And that takes me to my third point about Fuji, which is that if your lenses use less materials and your camera bodies use less materials, then you have less cost. And that absolutely translates. You go out and buy a flagship 56mm 1.2 from Fuji, it's about $1,000. That same type of lens, an 85mm perspective at a 1.2 with a Canon is going to run you almost $3,000. Now, there are some physical differences in how things compress at 85 versus how things compress at 56 1.2. So I'm not trying to say that it's exactly the same, but the perspective is pretty close. And once you get beyond a certain maximum aperture anyway, you're really splitting hairs when you get to medium telephotos. And for a lot of people, they're not going to tell the difference in terms of compression and whether one was shot at 85 or one was shot at 56. The only people who really care about that stuff is photographers. On the subject of price, yes, the lenses are smaller, but so are the camera bodies. If you go out and you purchase a Canon R5, that's their flagship high megapixel camera, that's about a $4,000 camera. If you go buy a Nikon Z8, that's about a $4,000 camera. If you go buy a Fuji X-H2, it's only a $2,000 camera. It's about half the price, and you get a lot of the same features. Now, it is debatable if full frame is worth it to you, and there's reasons why full frame costs what it costs, but depending on the style of photography you do and the type of photographer you are, those reasons may not even make sense for you to take advantage of in the first place. Staying on the subject of lenses, my fourth advantage I give to Fuji as a system is that they have a wider range of lenses. Fuji decided that they were going to go ahead and open up the X mounts to companies like Sigma and Tamron, and of course they have their native lenses as well. And within that ecosystem, there's just several different types of lenses you can get. Yes, they do have their flagship native lenses, they're weather sealed, they have super bright maximum apertures, but then Fuji decided, hey, maybe we'll make one, instead of it going to f1.2, maybe it'll go to f2, but we'll still have it be weather sealed and it'll be super tiny. And of course, that'll appeal to people like street photographers and travelers. And for people who are super strapped on their budget, we have the XC line, which isn't weather sealed, but the quality is still pretty darn good. It's pretty much in the same ballpark as those middle tiered lenses that are at f2. It's just more plastic. It doesn't have the weather sealing built into it. And then, of course, you have that freedom of choice. If you don't even want to go Fuji, you can go with something like a Tamron 17-70 f2.8. It's kind of a 24-105 f2.8. If you come from the full frame world, that's how this lens behaves. So when it comes to lenses, you have so many options at your disposal with the Fuji X mount. And so if you are watching this video, that may very well be a reason that tips you over to the Fuji side. Number 5, shooting on the Fuji X system is just more fun than shooting on other systems in general. They have cool cameras like the X100VI, which makes you just focus on photography. You don't have interchangeable lenses. It forces you into a situation that, in my opinion, makes you a better photographer if this is the right camera for you. You also have these retro looks that you can get in their XT line of cameras, the big dials, the command dials, the fact that you have the aperture ring on many models of lenses, to me makes the experience of shooting on a Fuji camera a little bit more tactile. And for some of you, that may very well help you understand photography a little bit better and make you a better photographer overall. I think that cameras like the Fuji X100VI, the reason why they have such a cult following, now some of it I think is just misguided people who are buying into hype, but the reason why I love this camera so much is it does just force me to be a photographer, to really rely on that exposure triangle, to really frame things up, and I feel like it makes me a more powerful and a better photographer. Also, there's the film simulations, which I already brought up when I talked about the sensor, but they're just more fun. You get those beautiful colors. That's why there's a huge community of people who shoot in just JPEG. They take it straight out of camera. They live with the results just like they're shooting on film. But with all that in mind, let me tell you about a few things that I don't like about the Fuji X system, and you should definitely take these into consideration if you're considering getting it and you haven't gone over to the system yet. The number one thing that bugs me about Fuji is their autofocus. For as much money as their cameras cost, yes, they're not as much as Sony, they're not as much as Canon, but when they roll out a flagship camera like the X-H2, and you can check out my review of the X-H2 in the link in the description below. The X-H2, I would say that the autofocus on it is average. I wouldn't say it's good. I would say it's average for 2024. I would say it's on par with where my Canon cameras were in like 2018 and Sony cameras were in 2018. When you take this camera, first, even this little $500 Canon R50, this little $500 Canon R50 has way stickier autofocus than this $2,000 Fuji X-H2. Now, there are people out there who'll say, well, you just need to learn how the Fuji auto-focusing system works. I have. I've gone through, I've programmed my camera several different ways. I've gone through all the different types of autofocusing and tracking, and it just throws things off. It tracks well, but then when you hit the shutter release, it usually throws things off. I have to have my AF lock on, and that comes down to a very major point about the autofocus is, if the autofocus is good, why is it so damn hard to learn? I can literally just take this R50, hold down focus, and it'll just follow my subject, and when I click the shutter release, it's in focus, the eye is razor sharp, and it gets the job done. Fuji is not that same experience, and so if you do shoot a style of photography that's heavily reliant on autofocus, you are going to get some misses. I've gotten misses upwards of 20 to 25% on this camera before. I would say on average, though, it's somewhere in that 10 to 15% range, and frankly, in 2024, I think that's unacceptable. Another thing about Fuji cameras that I don't particularly like is that I find that their cameras tends to be on the buggier side. They do roll out updates often on the firmware, and I do appreciate that, but it almost seems like they're testing us out as guinea pigs. I feel like anytime a firmware update rolls out to solve a problem, it creates new problems, and I don't know why that is. And I also find that Fuji cameras simply do not play well with Lexar and other cards. I've actually had my X-H2, which is a flagship camera, just freeze up on me while I'm trying to take stills. The focus box gets pegged in the lower left, and the only choice I have, because I can't turn off the camera from the on-off switch, is I actually have to remove the battery, reinsert the battery, close the compartment, and turn the camera back on. That is a serious bug, okay? And the fact that a camera like an X-H2, which is supposedly a flagship type camera, has that bug in it, to me, is a major concern. And I would love to see Fuji spend more time trying to figure out why their cameras are so darn buggy. That leads me to my next thing that I don't like about Fuji cameras, and while they're built okay, I don't necessarily think their build quality can hold a candle to Sony and definitely Nikon and Canon. I think the edges just wear out too easily. I found that on the shutter release that all of a sudden the edges start to wear from my fingers. It's not like I'm going to McDonald's and getting fries and putting my grubby paws all over my camera. I take care of my cameras. I baby my cameras. And I found that in general, Fuji cameras, they scratch easily, the edges wear, and if you want to defeat one of their weather seal cameras, you can absolutely do so by getting water on top of the hot shoe. If you do that, you will turn this guy into a paperweight. So do be mindful of that, is that you can't take these cameras out into downpours. They're not like my Canon cameras, which I take into downpours regularly. I've been doing that since I had a 6D over 8-9 years ago. I still, to this day, have never had a Canon camera fail on me. I've definitely had this X-H2 fail on me. I actually had to send it into Fuji about a year ago to get it fixed. I'm sure some of you watching this are like, yo, I actually shoot on a Fuji and I take it into sub-zero temperatures and it gets super cold and it gets super wet and I've never had any issues. I'm absolutely not discounting your experiences. I'm sure everything you say is true. I'm simply telling you about my experience, which is the one time I took this camera out into the rain, this X-H2, it died. So that's my experience. I've also on numerous occasions in temperatures where it's over 100 degrees when I'm shooting stills, the camera gives me an overheating warning. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that Fuji cameras are notorious for overheating. I've had the same experience on my GFX. Now, I want to tell you the last thing I don't like about Fuji cameras, and this is something that drives me crazy, is that their menus, in my opinion, are a nightmare. I don't like menus where you keep scrolling down and scrolling down and scrolling down and scrolling down. And you have to go 6 pages down inside their setup in order to get to something like button customization. I think that's a poorly designed menu. I think a well-designed menu is everything is in front of you. You go to the bottom of a page. When you get to the bottom of a page, you hit the next tab. You go to the bottom of the page, you hit the next tab. Everything is right there in front of you. And then they just do quirky things like if you're going to store your camera's settings, like let's say you want to store a custom setting, right? Like you have C1, C2, C3. I think you'd want to save that in your setup. Well, where do you have to save that on a Fuji camera? You have to save that in the image quality area. To me, image quality is where I select my film simulation. It should be where I select my clarity, my contrast, my curves, my dynamic range. That's all image quality stuff. A custom shooting mode in an image quality area of the menu, that doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And then Fuji has this thing called My Menu, which is actually really cool because you can put customized settings that you normally access in there. But for whatever reason, they omit things. Like you can't put format card in your My Menu settings. Well, if I want to put things that I commonly access in my My Menu section, why can't I put format card in there? Now, I do know that most Fuji models have a shortcut where if you hold the trash can down and like the rear command dial or something like that, you can format your card. But I might be in my menus and decide I want to format my card. I might already be in my menu and I just want to go to it and format it. And so there's just weird things like that about Fuji menus. And one of the biggest things I think Fuji could do to become a more major competitor in the camera market, besides overhauling their autofocusing system, is I think that they need to do a huge overhaul of their menu systems. So that is my summary of the Fuji X system. If you are considering it, you will have to weigh those pros and cons, and don't let the cons scare you. Every single camera, every single lens, every single camera system that I review on this channel, I always go hard on the cons because I want to make sure that you know all the bad things about a system or a camera or a lens before you go into it. And I don't think that the cons of the Fuji system are things that are deal breakers for me. They're just things that I wish that they could improve upon. That does it for today's episode. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching today. If you like what you saw, you like what you heard, tell me about it in the comments below. Do you agree with my positives and negatives on the Fuji X mount? Tell me about that in the comments below. Did this video help push you in one direction or the other when you are considering the Fuji X mount system? Tell me about that in the comments below. And if you like this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And if you like my opinions about photography and videography related subjects and you want to hear them in their more uncensored versions, I highly recommend you go check out my other YouTube channel, the F11 Photography Podcast. And it's also available on an audio only format on both Apple and Spotify. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.